A deadly shooting involving a federal Immigration and Customs Enforcement agent in Minneapolis is drawing national attention. It's for how cases like this are investigated when a federal officer uses force. The shooting happened around January 7th during a federal enforcement operation in Minneapolis. Authorities say an ICE agent shot and killed 37-year-old Renee Nicole Good. Video shared publicly appears to show Good attempted to drive away as the agent fired multiple shots into her car. The circumstances have raised questions about whether the use of force met federal standards. The incident has also sparked protests and renewed debate over accountability, jurisdiction, and the role of federal law enforcement.
So I think a good example of kind of what could happen here in this case was seen in the George Floyd case, right? So prosecution, wherever they went forward on state charges, on murder based counts. And then the feds also were looking at it, the federal authorities were looking at it for civil rights violations. And so what you may see is looking at this, the state looking at it from kind of the family of murder-based charges, murder, manslaughter, and so forth, and the federal government will be looking at it from a civil rights perspective to see whether or not the decedent's rights were violated.
Because the agent involved is a federal officer, the case falls primarily under federal jurisdiction, which changes how the investigation unfolds. When local or state officers are involved in deadly force cases, state agencies typically lead the investigation, and local prosecutors decide whether charges are filed. But when a federal agent is involved, the process is different. The FBI generally conducts the investigation, gathering evidence and interviewing witnesses. That information is then reviewed by the U.S. Department of Justice, which determines whether federal law or constitutional standards were violated. State authorities may have limited involvement, but under the U.S. Constitution's Supremacy Clause, federal officers acting within the scope of their duties are usually subject to federal rather than state prosecution. As a result, state charges against federal agents are relatively uncommon. Legal experts say the situation is complex.
Now, there are a lot of complicated legal doctrines about the extent to which the federal officials are subject to state liability, but there's no blanket immunity for federal officers. Now, whether they could face state charges is complicated by the way this investigation has unfolded, which is that the feds have excluded state and local law enforcement and are not cooperating with them. Now, that raises some legal questions, but it also raises some practical questions. After all, the state and local officials know more about their community than the feds do in general. And so keeping the state and local officials out of the investigation may actually compromise the federal investigation.
Enton says that questions about self-defense are separate from questions about federal immunity. Federal use of force policies allow deadly force only when an officer reasonably believes there is an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm.
And it's not like the Supremacy Clause is a get out of jail free card for a federal officer. It's a factor that may come into play. Now, in the end, the kinds of charges that a federal official, a federal officer might face might differ between federal and state court. So, for example, there is no general federal law prohibiting murder, right? So presumably, if there would be a federal charge, it would be something like the officer, by doing whatever the officer did, violated the constitutional rights of the victim. The authorities in Minnesota could charge someone, indeed, could charge the officer involved with murder or manslaughter or something if they think they have evidence that would support that. Now, um, therefore, the kinds of charges we might see will vary depending on which government might bring the charges.
Enton adds that potential charges would differ depending on who brings the case. Federal charges would likely focus on civil rights violations, while state prosecutors could pursue charges like murder or manslaughter if they believe the evidence supports it. Investigators will review body camera footage, witness statements, and forensic evidence to determine whether federal standards were met, even if no criminal charges are filed. Other reviews may continue, including internal agency investigations, administrative action, or civil lawsuits filed by the victim's family. Legal experts say cases involving federal officers often take longer because of multiple layers of review. No charges have been announced, and investigators say the review is ongoing. On Saturday morning, January 24th, a 37-year-old U.S. citizen was shot and killed by federal agents in Minneapolis. This shooting comes nearly 3 weeks after Renee Nicole Good was shot and killed by Border Patrol agents. Now, that man has been identified as Alex Preddy, who worked as an ICU nurse. Federal officials say the shooting occurred as agents were conducting a targeted operation, and that Preddy was armed and resisted attempts to disarm him, although he is a lawful gun owner. But visual footage also shared publicly has raised questions about the sequence of events. Local leaders, including Minneapolis officials and the governor of Minnesota, have condemned the latest killing and called for transparency and also an independent investigation into the events. And demonstrations at this moment are continuing. For American Crossroads, I'm Samana Sheikh.